Okay. Good afternoon and blessed be all. Thank you all for being here again. One more time, my name is Abel Jimenez, and I will be sharing with you guys a brief introduction or a brief study to the chapter of Isaiah 28. Okay. And this chapter is actually titled A Woe to the Leaders. And for those of you guys that are familiar with my style of teaching, I will be implementing or incorporating questions as I go along to our chapter. But before we begin, as always, we always like to do a little recap of the previous chapter that we last studied in Isaiah. So we're going to start with Isaiah number 27, the recap on it. And I like to remind everybody of what that is, okay? So let me just give me 1 second in here. All right, cool. So in Isaiah 27, we open with the chapter actually speaking about that is a judgment for the world. This is a point of reference back starting from a theme that started in chapter 13. And the chapter actually was broken up, at least for the purpose of my teaching, in 4 parts. The beginning of it actually speaks very clearly about a judgment of Satan, and we learn in there, our takeaway from there was that only God is to judge Satan. That even Christ that is going to be reigning here, the judgment of Satan itself is going to be smothered like a dragon, it says in there, by God himself. The chapter also refers to or speaks to the theme of the vineyard. And this is actually a recurring theme that in the book of Isaiah actually is always used to actually reference us, the flock of Christ, whether it's the actual people of Israel or us as believers or Gentiles that actually came through the salvation of Jesus Christ. The chapter continues on with the judgment of Israel, and he actually let us know how the city itself is going to be left to fend for itself, because this is part of, even in the book of Revelation, you will understand that this is something that is to happen in order for the second coming of Christ to take place. He actually talks or closes the chapter with the regathering of Israel, and Israel at this point is talking about the second coming of Christ, which is all of us that believe and have accepted Jesus Christ in combination, because that was a point of discussion for us, in combination with the people of Israel, because through the covenant of God with the people of Israel, they also obtain salvation, which was a very great question that we had for us. So again, this is all pertaining after the second coming of Christ. In Isaiah 28, as I mentioned, is a message to the leaders of North and South Israel, okay? In specific, the 2 tribes that he speaks of is the Ephraim, and he talks about the tribe of Judah in the south, okay? So it's a message for the future of Israel. And I mentioned this because when we talk about the prophecies, we understand that it's either, let's say, of interpretations of the past or actually things that are to come in the future. Isaiah being the prophetic, the actual messenger of God's, of Christ's second coming and first coming. We also interpret that everything that he does, most part of it is actually in the future of it. So this is about the future of Israel that is to happen, because they're going to be overtaken by outside forces. The chapter actually, as I mentioned, starts with a woe to the leaders of Ephraim and Judah. Now, my first question that I wanted to mention in this chapter talks about what a woe is. And when we are actually studying the Bible, this is very important that we mention it. Throughout this chapter also, we're going to show the differences between Israel and the leaders of the time, the leaders of the tribes of Israel at the time. We're also going to reference what is to come to the northern and the southern parts of the southern tribes of Israel, mainly because they're going to be overtaken by different powers. We're going to speak, as always, almost with Isaiah. We're always going to make a point of how he references the second coming of Christ. And the chapter closes with the glorification of God's power, which Isaiah does a lot, whether it's through songs or through different, let's say, points of clarifications that he does in his writing. All right. So as I mentioned, the chapter opens with a word, with a judgment. Now, when we actually talk about this, can anybody by a show of hand tell me what is a woe? Not just by what is by definition, or let's say when we are studying the Bible. Anybody? Diana, go ahead.
A trouble or a like distress. It's kind of like a message to tell people there's something coming.
Correct. So it's a sorrow, it's distress, but for the point of studying the Bible, it's very important that we know that it's a warning. All right. We mentioned this because in the chapters that are to come of Isaiah, he's going to have different woes or different messages, different warnings. Okay. But the textbook definition of it is sorrow, distress. Diana was kind enough to look it up for me. And we actually learned that. But when we actually study the Bible, it's important that we actually analyze the message from a spiritual sense, which in this case, a woe is a message of warning. Okay. God uses the kingdom of Assyria. So in verses 2 to 5, we understand that the message mainly is given at that part to the northern part of the northern tribes of Israel, in particular Ephraim. And this is how God uses the Assyrians, because they have to be smite because of their sin they have given to sin, and they actually have turned away from the things of Christ, from the followings of God, not of Christ at that point, because he's talking to Israel specific. So the things that actually pleases God, they have turned away from it. And this is God, how he uses, let's say, in this case, the kingdom of Assyria to actually strike the northern tribes. Okay. Oh, I gave the answer, but let's see who was paying attention. Go ahead, Titi. I think I heard you.
Huh?
Northern tribe.
Okay, yeah. Okay, all right. That series is gonna take the northern tribes. Thank you very much. I gave the answer before as I was thinking. And let me ask you, who was that, Brandon?
Yeah.
Brandon, what powers or what kingdom actually takes the southern tribe? Judah.
What are you asking? Wait, what?
What? Because I want to know. I know that Theo knows. I know that the minister is gonna know. But what power takes the southern part of the southern tribes actually is going to be taken? Because you mentioned, the Assyrians. I just gave you the Assyrians are going to take the northern part. So the tribe of Ephraim. Who's going to take Judah in the south?
This is the king Azar, Azary, something like that. Maybe not.
Okay, I mean, you broke it up a little bit. Well, Theo, what were you gonna say? What power?
The king of Babylon.
Babylonia, correct. The Babylonians are going to be taken. They're gonna take the southern part, and Judah is taken as part of that. The reason why this is important, because this is a message that Isaiah has to both the north and the south. Even though they're going to be taken by different powers, he actually speaking to them and he uses sort of what's going to happen first to the north part as an example of what is to happen to the south if they do not turn back to the righteous ways of God. Okay? Had a question? No? Okay. All right, cool. So with that said, how would the South be able to save itself? And this is a very giving it should be self-given. I want to ask anybody, let me say Theo Ralph, what do you think about how would the southern tribes or Judah, let's say, could save themselves if they see that the Assyrians take the northern part? What should they have done?
They have to depend on God.
Okay, depend on God. I like that answer. That's straightforward. That's correct. Minister, did you have anything else that you were going to add?
Jimbo.
Oh, Jimbo, go ahead.
Because if they repent.
Okay, they repent and turn back to the faith. I like that. I like both of those answers because that's correct. So repentance of let's say the ways of what they were doing at the time, and I am going to speak of what sin specifically is talked about in this chapter in a little bit in the next slide. But repentance and turning their ways back to the pleasing ways of God. All right, that's the way that they could save themselves. Unfortunately, they do not do that at that time. In this chapter, also in verses 9 to 11, it specifically talks about the differences. It gives us examples about the differences between Isaiah and the leaders of Israel at the time. If I'm not mistaken, in there he talks about like, who is this? Who you're talking to? The leaders actually tell Isaiah, who said that you're talking to? Who do you think you're talking to? They say, do this, do that. I rule for this or I rule for that. A little here, a little there, and everything like that. And this is something that we see that is a recurring theme between Isaiah and the leaders of the different tribes of Israel. In particular, only happens when he's calling to their attention their sinful ways. All right. Now, my question is very simple. I'm gonna ask Jimbo. Jimbo, let me ask you, how does this relate to today? This exact same, let's say, scenario, or anybody else. I like to open it to anybody else that would like to take a crack at it. How could we relate this to today?
I would say people doing unjust things and not following the ways of God and just doing just whatever they feel like doing, not following the ways of the Lord.
Okay, all right. That's one interpretation. That's good. I like that. I like that. Anybody else has a take?
Parents talking to kids.
Okay, Diana said parents talking to the kids. I don't know if Isaiah actually sees himself as a parent of the leaders of the different tribes. Go ahead, Hannah.
I was gonna say kind of leading by example. Like, you can't say I can do this in this scenario, but then you can't do it in this scenario. So you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
Like I can drink at this party, but you can't drink at this party. You know what I mean?
I like that. I like that because Isaiah is a very consistent leader, and he is a prophet that is very consistent on his ways. So I do like that you can relate it that way. Anybody else wants to do a contribution? Because I was going to give a different take about it also. Go ahead, Titi.
So when I was studying this chapter, it explained it as the leaders, what they heard from Isaiah was blah, 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 blah. And so, like, sometimes somebody's talking to you and you don't want to give them respect. You don't even listen to what they're saying.
That's good. And it's dismissive. It's been dismissive. That's what Titi's talking about here. And to today, the minister could relate to this, and to your Ralph, very big, right? Because oftentimes, I know that when we used to work together, we were always very dismissive. We're surrounded by people that were dismissive to us whenever, let's say, we wanted to talk about the things of God. Whenever we talked about the different messages that were very clear and cut, you actually get dismissed, or actually even worse, you get shunned almost like, okay? Tio Eddie always talks to us about the different examples of his work on how it is that people actually, even by those that are that call themselves Christians, actually he always is criticized or even looked upon in a bad way when he actually speaks about the clear messages that are given from God. So I gotta say, they actually are dismissive, like Titi said, but they also oftentimes actually look at themselves like, yo, you're talking, when Tio talks about in front of me to other ministers, our minister used to always says, you know, how they sometimes get offended, like, well, you talking to me? Talking to me about these things that are like, what is this? A rule for this or a rule for that? So far, so on. It's something that happens today. It was interesting to me to see that this was happening so clear cut back over 2,000 years ago to Isaiah, just like it's happening today. In the chapter, we also find out that God provides to us actually for the tribes of Israel at that time a path to salvation. Okay, and that is actually, if I'm not mistaken, who raised their hand? Tio, that was okay. Tio, hold on. He actually speaks about that he's going to put a very stone in Mount Sinai. Now, who is the stone? Go ahead. Who, minister, go ahead. Jesus. And this is how we know that actually is talking about the second coming of Christ. Verses 16 on, he actually speaks about what's going to happen or how we are supposed to do the different things that we are supposed to do. This is how we know that he's talking directly about Jesus' second coming and not the first. Remember, this time we're talking about the second coming of Christ, at least in this chapter of Isaiah. What can we do to continue in the path of salvation and we don't end up like the southern tribes or Judah and Israel at that time? What can we do, Diana? What do you think we could do? Since we already got a warning.
Listen to the warning, change our ways.
She mentioned, what was the first word that she mentioned? You
Change.
mentioned what? Listen.
Listen.
Listen to the warnings. And I gotta say, in the chapter, it says very, very important. He actually clearly says, listen to the instructions of God. And he will tell you in there what it is, all the things, let's say, that we are supposed to do. In verse 23, he tells you in there, listen and hear my voice. He actually tells very clear to his Isaiah that this is the message that we are to give. Let me see. Oh, this is the last one. What sin, Theo Ralph, is spoken of in this chapter? Go
Drunkenness.
ahead. Yeah, Theo Ralph, you don't have to raise your hand when I already called your name. Yes, go ahead. What was it?
Drunkenness.
Drunkenness. Very good. Very good. Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Theo. And let me ask you, what is drunkenness associated with? What is drunkenness always associated with? Go ahead. Theo.
Depression.
Okay, depression, but he also, I gotta tell you, that was Hannah. Hannah, go ahead. Let me let Hannah contribute. Hold on, Minister. Thank you.
But it's essentially like just bad behavior, like immoral things, wrong things.
Bad behavior, that's correct. Remember, sin calls upon sin. All right, remember that. Sin calls upon sin. All right, so one sin leads to another. So we always have anger, rage, and again, it's a gateway for other types of sin. So remember, we have spoken about in here before that even in this season, we are to remember that necessarily drinking or sharing with our families is not necessarily frowned upon. Okay, it's not necessarily good for us either, but it's not frowned upon. It's not something that God says, let's say, we are not do. However, drunkenness is a clear sin renounced throughout the Bible, whether it's in the Old Testament or in the New Testament. And it is because of the pathway or the connection to other bigger sins that actually are associated with being drunkenness. And this is a message that I wanted to close on, because in this season, that is exactly what we got. Let's say the biggest takeaway that I want us to have in this one is that even though we are allowed to share in good faith with our friends and family, we also are to remember that sometimes those behaviors lead us to clear sin, even though it's not necessarily, the action itself is not frowned upon. Any question, comments, or concern? Go ahead, Hannah.
How did you know it was talking about Assyrians?
So historically speaking, we have actually mentioned that the Assyrians are the ones that are going to take Ephraim before. So in the message, in the chapter itself, standing by itself, you're not going to gather that because it doesn't mention it by name. Okay. To Judea, it does tell them later on, like, oh, you're going to be overtaken and so far, so on. You're right. According to the chapter, it doesn't. However, I wanted to actually, like I do my series of questioning, I wanted to pull to some of or appeal to, let's say, the wisdom that the actual group or the actual church has gathered from past chapters. So that's what it is. Historically speaking, it is the Assyrians that actually take the northern parts, the northern tribes of Israel. Go ahead, Didi.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so also in here, where it says the people of the death or something like that, he's referring to the Egyptians.
Yeah.
So Hannah knows that sometimes it doesn't say exactly who it is. You have to kind of like, almost like you go into history and know that at that time the leaders were trying to make up a hookup with the Egypt to fight the Assyrians. They were trying, they were doing diplomatic kind of, like even today, countries align themselves with other ones ready to battle and all these things. So he was saying, that's why for these kind of chapters, especially Hannah, you have to listen to or read you cannot just read it. I would never understand.
Yeah, you got it. What it is referring to, you got to rely on the point of references. There's always going to be points of references that are going to be scattered through, let's say, this chapter. This is a very difficult book, as the minister has told us before. And I am finding that out very heavily, especially because it references itself a lot with what I believe is the toughest, almost power, like in a very difficult way to interpret and to hold the book of Revelation. This book aligns itself or uses that book a lot to reference each other. As the minister has taught us, that the best way to actually study the Bible is to actually make sure that it verifies itself. The Bible does not dismantles itself. Very few, let's say, verses or chapters are going to stand by themselves. Very few, very, very few. Okay, very clear cut. One of the things, for example, that always comes to mind is whenever I have done the study about baptism. It's only one time that it's mentioned that is like, oh, okay, you're supposed to baptize in this way and that way. But for the most part, you will see that everything in the Bible is relying upon itself. So one book relies on the other. So it's important, Hannah, to the point of Titi's making, to be very mindful of the point of references, both from a historical standpoint and from a spiritual standpoint, in order for us to properly understand these chapters. Any other question, comments, or concerns? Go ahead, Theobald.
Yes, when I was reading the chapter, I read that they said that the prophet, they were staggered from beer and with wine. And some of the people that analyze the chapter, it's a very deep chapter. They're talking about ungodly prophets and priests. Do you have any idea who they referring to here? Like specifically between the verse of 9 through 11, they were analyzing that and they made that comment.
So when he's talking about that, he's talking about the leaders of the church, or the leaders of the tribes of Israel. Now, I'm gonna tell you, there's one person that I always follow. You know who it is, baby. David Gusick. There you go. David Gusick specifically talks about, when I was looking at his breakdown of this specific chapter, he talks about that parts of the tribes of the Levites, because mainly talks about different wines and things of that nature, and they had access to a lot of, let's say, abundance, if you will. Perhaps are the ones leaders in here. That's just a breakdown of one person, okay? It doesn't give us any specific, but to answer you, Theo, there's historians that actually break it down like, okay, the Levites, and also since he's talking about the high leaders that got offended by Isaiah when he's giving them the warning, he also believes that the Levites obviously are the people that come to mind because they're the teachers of the teachers. So they are the ones that are most likely to get offended when actually presented with this type of let's say warning, Hopefully that answers your question. So we don't have a specific set of people, of individuals that he talk, but we know it's mainly to the leadership that actually engages in drunkenness and so far so on.
Another thing, Abel, that they mentioned that maybe you have to know about it, but I'm not sure. There was 3 guys analyzing this whole chapter, and they all have different understanding and interpretation of the whole thing. Yeah. And one of them stated that Isaiah was just the prophet on the southern kingdom of Israel, not the north. Is that correct, or that's wrong?
That is something that has been debated, but I gotta tell you, hopefully the minister can back me up a little bit on this, and I gotta tell you, we have sufficient evidence that actually points out that Isaiah was a prophet for all tribes of Israel, north and south. The reason why that's said is because he spends a lot more time in the southern part of Israel. But in I think it's chapter 16, later on in the future chapters, like 40s and everything like that, we will learn that he travels again to the northern part. So that is incorrect. That is actually he is a prophet for all the tribes of Israel, north and south.
Not just the south, like these people.
No, not just the south.
Okay.
Taking point, Abel, is the issue that he's giving a warning here to the northern tribes.
Correct.
The kingdom of Israel divided. 10 tribes went to the north, and then Judah, and I don't remember if Benjamin.
To stay in the south, yeah.
Yeah, Benjamin and Judah stay in the south. So he giving a clear, so he might not be heard by the northern kingdom, but he was prophesying to them and giving the warnings of God. It's written right there on the 28th. It amazes me that a scholar or a historian would say something like that. But
Yeah, they said it, yeah, so I
Yeah.
wasn't sure.
Well,
One-
one of the reasons that Theo Ralph points to that is because Isaiah is one of the most oftentimes try to be discredited. He
Mhm.
tries to be discredited a lot since he is the messianic prophet. One of the tactics that other historians believe that why he's attacked so much is because if you attack Isaiah, then you can attack the concept of Christianity on its own, since he's the one that prophesies the most about it. But that doesn't surprise me, Theo. But just to be clear, he is a prophet of all Israel, north and south. Okay.
very good. Thank you, Abel, and
Thank you.
to every teacher that